Alright, so in these lessons we will be focusing on IELTS, reading for the academic test. So the reading section of the academic test, it includes 3 passages, and the passages are approximately 600 to 700 words. Each passage is followed by 12 to 14 questions, so a total of 40 questions. So 40 questions total, 12 to 14 questions per passage. And the total amount of time that you have to do this is 1 hour. One hour or 60 minutes, which of course means that you have 20 minutes to read and answer the questions for each passage. So 20 minutes to read and answer questions for each passage. Now, the reason why that's important is because during the test they do not tell you every 20 minutes to go to the next passage. They just tell you that you have 60 minutes for the reading section. So you have to be very careful with your time, you have to pay attention, and when you're practicing at home, you should try to practice completing the reading and the answers for one passage in 20 minutes. What this means is that if you spend more than 20 minutes on one passage, you're taking time away from the other passages. So be very careful about that. Again, remember that the IELTS is called a progressive test because each section increases in difficulty. So what that means is passage 1 is easier than passage 2 is easier than passage 3 is the most difficult. So be careful. If you spend too much time on the first passage, you will have less time for the more difficult passages. And this is very true. Later in the lessons I will explain why the second and third passage become more difficult. So when you're practicing, again, pay attention to this 20-minute time limit. Okay, so first, let's look at an example passage. And this example passage and the questions that we will be using, it's taken from www.aehelp.com. Please visit us there for more practice for the academic reading. The reading passages include the audio with British speakers reading the passages. This is very useful for practicing the reading, practicing fluency and pronunciation, so please visit us at our website and look into the practice tests or the full course for more of these types of passages. The second step that we're going to take is look at key reading strategies and practice. So with reading, you have to practice. You must practice before the test to increase your fluency, your speed, and your comprehension. And I'll show you some very good strategies to help you quickly improve your reading ability and help you understand what you read. And as a third step, we will look at specific strategies for reading questions. So, as I mentioned, there are many different types of questions that you can see after the reading passages, and some even before. We'll look at a few of those, and I'll teach you some ways to understand those questions very quickly, very clearly, and to be able to answer those questions with confidence and accuracy. So we'll do that as the third part. Now first, let's look at the example passage, again taken from www.aehelp.com.
Icebergs. The word iceberg derives from the Dutch word ijsberg, meaning ice mountain. Icebergs are sections of glaciers that are broken off during the warm summer months and float freely in open water. Icebergs are typically found in open water, predominantly around Greenland and Antarctica. The characteristics of icebergs, their historical impact, and the methods we employ today to monitor them are important topics. The reason icebergs exist is because of the difference between the density of ice and the density of salt water. The density of ice is approximately 920 kilograms per cubic meter, while the density of salt water is approximately 1025 kilograms per cubic meter. Because ice is less dense than water, it floats. However, because the difference in densities is so small, only about 10% of the iceberg is visible above the ocean's surface. The rest of the iceberg hides below the water. This is the origin of the familiar expression, tip of the iceberg, used to describe a situation where only part of the problem is noticeable. Icebergs range in height from 1 meter all the way up to over 75 meters above sea level. The height measures the visible portion of the iceberg. The tallest icebergs may have a total height of over 650 meters, including their underwater portion. The largest ever recorded was 168 meters above the water, meaning the entire height of this floater was likely greater than 1,500 meters. For reference, that is twice the height of most skyscrapers. Different sized icebergs had different name classifications. The smallest icebergs are called brash ice. The next category up in size is called growlers, and the ones after that are called bergibits. For whatever reason, after those three classes, the people in charge of naming the icebergs got a little less creative. The next classes simply ranged from small to very large. Icebergs can be massive objects. Very large icebergs can weigh more than 200,000 tons. The largest iceberg ever recorded was over 30,000 square kilometers in area. Again, for reference, that is the approximate size of the country of Belgium. The most famous iceberg in history is undoubtedly the one which eventually sunk the English ship Titanic off the coast of Newfoundland in 1912. At that point in time, there was no central group which monitored iceberg activity. Ships relied on lookouts to spot the icebergs. For the Titanic, the unfortunate attitude was that any iceberg big enough to do damage to the ship would be seen in time. This attitude was, of course, catastrophically wrong. The main reason it failed was the remarkable calmness of the water that ill-fated night. The easiest way to spot an iceberg from afar is to see waves crashing up against it. But on the night the Titanic sank, there were no such helpful waves. For all intents and purposes, the iceberg was invisible until it was too late. The captain swerved at the last minute, but as the side of the ship scraped across the iceberg, the hull of the ocean liner tore open. Things still may have been fine had it not been for the poorly designed watertight compartments. It turns out that when too many compartments were affected, the water was simply able to spill over to all the other compartments. This was an engineering defect that contributed to the Titanic's sinking. After the disaster of the Titanic, maritime authorities realized that a system needed to be put into place to monitor icebergs so that such a catastrophe would not be repeated. By 1914, the International Ice Patrol, IIP, was formed. Their purpose was to track all of the relevant meteorological and oceanographical data and to chart the movement of all major icebergs. Today, technology is used to track iceberg data. The Canadian Space Agency has multiple radar satellites which send microwaves off the ocean surface and record the reflection to track the movement of the icebergs. Maritime vessels have access to this information in real time, which allows them to know exactly where any local icebergs are at any moment, meaning that a repeat of the Titanic disaster is virtually impossible.
Okay, so now that we have looked at this passage and we've read this passage, we can go on to the second part of these lessons, which are the key reading strategies, and we'll look at those in the next part. I'll go through step by step and explain what you should do to practice before the test so that you can get a nice high score over 6.5.